Now we're here on something called the Water Quality Protection Lands. And these are lands that are protected so that our aquifer is protected. That our aquifer is kind of an underground river. And what's wonderful about this protected land is it's all natural. And so we can find some things here we might not normally find in our backyard. All the water, when it rains here, it lands on the ground and ends up at a place really close to where your school is. Barton Springs.
Barton Springs Edwards Aquifer is 250,000 acres southwest of Austin, going all the way out past Dripping Springs, a little bit into Blanco County, going all the way south to Buda and Kyle. That water sometimes would travel many miles over the aquifer, through the aquifer, before it came out in Barton Springs pool. There's always been the place where people could gather, have the public dialogue, have a sense of community. That public common ground in Austin has always been Barton Springs. So I grew up understanding, not as a scientist, but as someone who swam in the pool every day, it really and truly was something that we could all value and appreciate. And I would see the fish and all the beautiful plants, and it was crystal clear. Then we would see days when the pool was a little bit cloudy because there was some construction. And then the silt was getting into the aquifer and coming out of Barton Springs in the pool. So when the plants began to disappear and the wildlife in the pool began to change, we took that very personally.
There's an organization like Save Our Springs Alliance that is educating the public because we all love the springs, but we don't know what to do to keep it clean.
At Barton Springs, not only was our common ground, but it really was part of our drinking water supply, with more than 75,000 people depending on the Barton Springs aquifer for their drinking water. So we really did have to talk about the aquifer and not just Barton Springs. It's 2 counties, several cities. How are we going to address such a huge area?
We have a problem. What's the logical step? Limit development on the watershed. Move it. Move the development off of the watershed. And I support the strongest possible protection for the Edwards Aquifer and for Barton Springs.
That initial will was really born out of that citizens movement that came to City Hall and stayed up till 2 o'clock in the morning and said, we don't want this development impacting Barton Springs.
If you build over the aquifer, you will pollute our water supply.
And I think it was the realization of going to the science people and say, okay, what sort of regulations is going to do it? And the science people saying, you don't understand. The land you have to protect is so far out of your regulatory area, you cannot regulate in other jurisdictions. If you want to protect it, you're just going to have to buy it. And at that moment in time, the public demand was, if the land's for sale, let's buy it.
The history of this property is really interesting because it was bought by a developer that had it final platted for 1,100 homes. And the visionaries at the city of Austin knew the hydrology here, that we're in the fast recharge path for Barton Springs. So they figured it would be cheaper to save this watershed than try and fix Barton Springs or have Barton Springs dry up. I came out here actually to find other buyers. It was really hard to get around and see the property because it was just completely overgrown. It was covered in cedar. It had been sort of mismanaged by ranchers. And we would flow through until we found an open space that we could see. And then I fell in love with it. I just had a feeling about biodiversity, about beauty, about culture and history. I just had this intuition that it was here. When I first bought the property, one of my goals was to bring it back to its state that would have looked like it was 1,000 years ago. With mechanical clearing with my bobcat and the use of fire and overseeding native grasses, we're getting really close. And it would be an oak and hardwood mosaic with grasslands and juniper in some of the canyons.
So I figure the water temperature is like 55. It definitely makes Barton Springs feel warm on a day like today. Over 30% of the water that ultimately comes out of Barton Springs originates here in Onion Creek, almost 20 miles from Barton Springs. This is Swallet, one of those super important caves that's underneath the creek bed that takes a tremendous amount of water in the aquifer. In the Barton Springs recharge zone, this is the means of water getting underground. If it doesn't get underground in the recharge zone, it's not able to get in the aquifer. The water is super high quality, which is important because it only takes 3 days to get to Barton Springs. So what goes into the ground is almost exactly what comes out of the ground at Barton Springs. We're doing what the voters asked us to do in 1998, in 2006, and in 2012 with those bonds that said, buy land to protect Barton Springs. We've taken it the additional step of saying we're gonna manage this right so that we keep these natural functions functioning as they have for literally millennia, 10,000 plus years. If we could get down to the aquifer, you know what we might find there? Salamanders. So we can't see them now because the water table is so far down, they never come up that far. But if we could get down to the aquifer, there's only 100 feet before we would actually be sitting on top of that aquifer. When this land sold, this could have had up to anywhere between 80 to who knows how many houses on it. By buying this property and protecting it, it's preventing some of that suburbanization that would otherwise occur right here on this important part of the recharge zone. So these are really some of the most important lands to protect. So we got some melica here, which we just started harvesting. It's in our seed mix now. Very cool. We have this, I believe, is inland sea oats. Anybody want to?
We have so many volunteers that go out and collect by hand native grass seeds, and then we'll reseed it over an area. And so in doing that, People are helping to contribute to this habitat restoration, but at the same time, they're getting to know one another, they're getting to interact with the biologists that care for this land, they're learning how to identify different native grasses.
I'm not sure where Jeff's Place came from, but today we're gonna help make Jeff's Place back into nature's place. If you can imagine, just 2 years ago, there was a house right here. We can still see some of the gaps on the ground, so we're filling in those things, but the whole idea being we don't want bare ground that can erode, that can lead to sedimentation, that can go into the creek and make the creek less pristine. Anybody want a potato rake? This is one of the best tools man has created.
Now what do I do with this
Pointy
thing?
side down. By having that dense collection of grasses and roots, we can keep that water as clear as it is going down into the caves or into recharge features that then come out of Barton Springs. As we go up here on the left, we're gonna see a couple of caves, places for little critters like ringtail cats and porcupines like to live in these kinds of structures.
That's really cool.
You know, when people live on the land, and Mr. Searcy lived here for almost 30 years, you develop an affinity for it, you develop an appreciation for it, you stop to think, what will be my legacy? And just turning it into a lost oasis hollow or a once upon paradise lane, you know, this is more like a place that still existed, not just as a memory, but a place that's real. Kind of like we predicted as a possibility for the hike with 40 eyes, we have a new cave right here. So never documented before, we just found it. We don't know how big it is, how small it is, whatever it is, but it's also like ideally located right in a streamway, which means this can take more water than the cave normally could. It means it has a whole drainage basin upstream.
I'm excited to see what that's gonna grow into, Kevin.
Me too. I bet there's gonna be a volunteer project involved, but it's really cool to find it. Mr. Searcy was always interested in just making sure this land stayed protected, that maybe in the future his kids, his grandkids, his great-grandkids could still come out and see this thing.
Yeah, good job. So what have you noticed since you came inside this cave?
Rocks.
Rocks, lots of rocks. Why are they so slippery?
The mud from rain.
But we're underground. How did the rain get in here?
From the hole.
The hole.
Yep.
Which hole?
The hole on top that we climbed through.
Mm-hmm.
Did you actually leave it open?
I did leave it open. Do you think it only came through that hole? How else could it get in here, that water?
By the drops.
I see a drip right above your head that's coming in to the cave. Over here. Yeah, that's another way that water gets into the cave. It comes all the way through the ground. Oh, it might take a long time to drip to you.
It dripped.
It did. Sometimes we'll look up at the ceiling and see roots with some drops of water on them and see that the plants are helping to get that water underground and eventually into the aquifer. It's interesting to think about where is the water coming from that we are climbing through the mud that it's made, and how does it impact the cricket that lives here or the millipede that I found or the scorpion on the ceiling. And so once we start thinking about Barton Springs ourselves swimming there, and we start thinking about the salamanders that really rely on those springs, that connection becomes a little bit stronger between what's happening right in your own schoolyard or right in your own lawn and how that affects the springs.
And it's holding me. It's walking on me.
You did. It looks like a little spider. Look at that. Where can you want to set him down somewhere?
Around it.
Oh my God, I can't believe I got one.
They determined that it was actually a Barton Springs salamander, which opened up a whole new sort of study of distribution of populations and genetics. So that was another just diamond that we found here that we had no idea was here.
This is a site that we now know, based on genetic data, is the southwesternmost site for Barton Springs salamanders. So I'm doing a kind of a fine-scale population genetic analysis to try and figure out kind of patterns of migration and how many salamanders there are. Kind of trying to see, you know, whether or not salamanders are moving among these different sites. I mean, we kind of assume they are, but we don't really know. They're all very big, healthy salamanders.
We had no idea that there was a salamander here. We have warblers here, I've heard them. We had no idea that there was an endangered bird here. And who knows what else science that's gonna pop up that we don't know about. And so it really does sort of put things in perspective of how impactful this recent history has been on our environment. I sometimes come and sit on the Indian middens, which are perhaps 5,000 years old. And I think of people who lived in harmony with their land and basically left it for us. And these are some archaeological artifacts that I have found here that are from up to 3,000 years BC. This is a 6-inch knife blade that was perhaps used for ceremonies or skinning a buffalo. We're not sure, but it's something I found on one of the middens when I went up to ask God, should I keep doing this project? And I looked down and saw this knife, and I remember looking into the heavens and saying, you don't have to yell. I get it. The plans for this ranch to be developed with 1,100 homes would have been to bulldoze all karst features, including the cave with bats in it, and bulldoze the archaeological site. That one burial ground would have been a driveway. So I feel pretty happy to have been part of that effort to save some history and some souls, you know.
I'm sorry, but I feel that if we really want to preserve this, and I think almost everyone does, I think the city and some other large governing body, perhaps the state or the nation, should buy this land. I mean, the developers own this land, and then naturally they want to profit from it, but could we buy it from them? I think all the land over the aquifer should be owned as a preserve. Maybe that's pie in the sky dreaming, but I'd like to see it happen.
The actions we took almost 20 years ago to start protecting these lands have made a difference. With the water quality protection lands, we protect about 25% of the recharge zone, but only 7% of the contributing zone. For us to be successful in the future, we're really going to have to protect more of that contributing zone and all the things that might influence water in this creek. So this could be roads and highways, as well as subdivisions and other sorts of developments. And a development-oriented future yields lower water quality.
Just what I'm looking for. I do want you to know how important it is that you're part of the early work on the Violet Crown Trail. It is going to be a regional trail from Zilker Park, which is roughly 5 miles that way, all the way down into Hayes County.
Ready for work.
Through voter education, through voters approving many bonds for open space, parks, and trails, we've got almost 50,000 acres preserved in perpetuity. That's a fifth of the aquifer that the community has protected just in the past 25 years. So we really do have to change the paradigm to think about the longer term. We're still sort of in the early stages of having that 100-year conversation or that 500-year looking forward to keeping it beautiful and keeping it special and making sure that it is the Austin we love.
And Austin and Central Texas is really behind the curve. Nebraska has like a tax on canoe rentals that goes to open space. And Colorado, of course, has been groundbreaking in their funding. You can go catch a trout in 5 minutes in Boulder, Colorado. It's just politically, how do we get it on the ballot? How do we get it past politicians? But I think a permanent funding source, along with bonding, would be the perfect solution for that. And so we are conserving the watershed, but we're also, there's so many corollary benefits to preserving Central Texas land, and that's our culture, endemic species, endangered species, and then just our lifestyle, our Texasness. I mean, it really is not just about Barton. It's about keeping a healthy harmony of all the living beings together.